Welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're tackling a book that really sparked a lot of conversation a few years back. Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance's memoir about growing up in Appalachia and the Rust Belt. We've got excerpts from interviews with Vance and a bunch of reviews too, so we can kind of get a 360 view of what made this book such a phenomenon. Have you ever wondered what life is really like in Appalachia beyond the stereotypes?
It's a region that definitely gets misunderstood, and Vance offers a really personal look at the culture and the challenges. But he also ties his own story to broader social and economic forces, which is what makes it so compelling.
Absolutely. And Vance himself is such an interesting figure. Former Marine, Yale Law School grad, not exactly who you picture when you think about a struggling Rust Belt town like Middletown, Ohio, where his family ended up after migrating from the mountains of Kentucky.
Yeah, he kind of breaks the mold. But he's very open about his hillbilly heritage. He even emphasizes his Scots-Irish descent and sees it as a distinct cultural group. It's not just about being white, it's about a shared history and identity that really shapes his perspective.
You can feel that throughout the book. And those shared experiences, as Vance describes them, were often really tough. He talks about poverty being a family tradition, generations of day laborers, sharecroppers, coal miners, factory workers, that kind of intergenerational poverty. It's not just about lacking money, is it?
No, not at all. It creates a whole set of cultural norms and beliefs that can be incredibly hard to break free from. Think about it. If you grow up seeing everyone around you struggling, it can be really hard to imagine a different future for yourself.
Yeah, it's like the American dream feels completely out of reach.
Exactly. And that's something Vance captures so well in his descriptions of Jackson, Kentucky, where he spent his summers. This small town nestled in the mountains. Beautiful, but isolated. Strong community ties deep respect for tradition.
He really paints such a vivid picture of it. Remember that anecdote he shares about funeral processions in Jackson?
Oh, yeah. Where everyone in town stops and stands at attention as the hearse goes by. It's such a powerful image of that communal spirit. That connection to their roots, you can almost feel the weight of tradition and history in that moment.
It's beautiful, but I can also see how that same strong sense of community could also create challenges when families like Vance's migrated to places like Ohio, hoping for a better life.
It's like trying to transplant a whole ecosystem. They brought their culture and habits with them, but adapting to a new environment and way of life, that's a whole other hurdle.
Absolutely. Now, I'm curious what you made of that story about Vance's grandmother watching Tiger Woods win the Masters.
Which one?
The one where she gets so angry about that racist
Oh,
comment.
yeah, the one about serving fried chicken and watermelon at the winner's dinner. That one
Right.
really jumped out at me, too.
It's so revealing about how she saw the world. She saw this kinship between black people and poor white people,
Hmm.
like they were both outsiders,
Hmm.
up against a system dominated by wealthy elites.
Hmm.
It made me think about the parallels between those experiences in a whole new way.
It's easy to overlook those connections. But that anecdote forces you to confront the shared experiences of marginalized groups, even across racial lines. And it speaks to a deep resentment towards those perceived as holding power and privilege.
That resentment comes up a lot in the book, but Vance also highlights some key differences between his Appalachian upbringing and the more mainstream American experience. One of the biggest, it seems, is family structure.
Right. That contrast between the extended kin networks in Appalachia and the nuclear family model that's more common in other parts of the U.S. In Appalachia, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, they're all deeply involved in raising children.
It's a much tighter-knit community, everyone looking out for each other.
Exactly. And Vance argues that the modern welfare system, which is designed around that nuclear family model, often fails to recognize the crucial role those extended kin networks play.
He even suggests it can actually harm children's well-being because it doesn't reflect the reality of how these families function. It's a perspective you don't hear very often. And it definitely made me think about the unintended consequences of well-intentioned policies.
It raises the question, are we designing systems that truly support families in all their diverse forms? Or are we imposing a one-size-fits-all model that doesn't always work?
That's a big question for sure. And speaking of families, we can't overlook the fact that Vance's own childhood was marked by some really significant challenges. His descriptions of his mother's drug addiction
Mm-hmm.
and the violence he witnessed are just incredibly difficult to read.
Yeah, the constant threats, the physical abuse, that pervasive sense of fear and instability. It's heartbreaking to imagine living with that kind of chaos every day, never knowing what to expect.
And he shares that shocking story about being nearly placed in foster care at age 12 because his mother threatened to kill him and herself in a car. It's a stark reminder of the trauma that so many children experience within their own homes.
It's incredibly disturbing. And it speaks to that cycle of dysfunction and trauma that can be so hard to break free from. It's not just about individual choices. There are often these deeply rooted issues that contribute to these situations.
And did you notice how Vance talks about feeling alienated from the legal system? Like it was an outside force imposed on his community, rather than a system designed to protect him.
He even admits to lying to a judge to protect his family, even though he knew it was wrong. That tension between loyalty to family and the expectations of the law really stuck with me.
It makes you wonder, what does it take to build trust in institutions when there's such a history of mistrust and misunderstanding?
Especially when those institutions are often seen as failing to serve the needs of marginalized communities.
And it's clear from Vance's account that drug and alcohol problems were rampant in his community. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He talks about the opioid epidemic ravaging families and towns, destroying lives, fueling a cycle of despair.
It's not just opioids, though. He describes a culture where violence and chaos were almost normalized, both in his family and in the wider community. It's almost like a pressure cooker environment, where these destructive behaviors become a way of coping with the stresses of poverty and lack of opportunity.
Remember that darkly humorous anecdote about his grandmother threatening to run over the kids he was hanging out with when she suspected he was experimenting with drugs?
Oh, yeah. Tough love taken to the extreme.
But it also highlights a key observation Vance makes, that many who escaped this cycle did so by marrying outsiders.
People who brought stability, a different perspective, a way out.
It raises some interesting questions about the role of social mobility and exposure to different ways of life in breaking these cycles.
Makes you wonder, what does it take to create those bridges between different worlds, to offer people a chance to see beyond the confines of their own community and imagine a different future for themselves?
I think we've laid some good groundwork here, exploring Vance's background and the complexities of life in Appalachia. But there's so much more to uncover, particularly the role of religion and faith in shaping Vance's worldview. Let's dive into that next.
You know, one thing that really struck me about Vance's descriptions of religion in Appalachia is how complex it is. It's not just this simple, unquestioning faith that some people might assume, like take his grandmother, for instance.
Yeah, she was deeply devout in her personal beliefs, but deeply skeptical of organized religion, saw churches as corrupt institutions. It's almost a contradiction.
It might seem that way on the surface, but I think it speaks to a broader trend that Vance highlights, this declining church attendance among lower-income Americans. Which is interesting because we often picture these communities as being deeply religious.
Right. And Vance grappled with that tension, too. He talks about his own struggle to reconcile his Christian upbringing with modern science, particularly the rejection of evolution by some conservative Christians. It's like these two fundamental parts of his world were clashing.
Yeah, and for a kid who grew up believing in the Left Behind series, that clash must have been pretty intense. Remember that anecdote about his fear that Kofi Annan might be the Antichrist?
Oh, yeah, it sounds almost comical now.
Yeah.
But it shows the power of those beliefs, how deeply they shaped his worldview at the time.
It makes you think about how those early experiences with faith and belief systems can have such a lasting impact on how we see the world.
Absolutely. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the aspect of Hillbilly Elegy that really put it on the map. Politics.
Yeah.
Specifically, the appeal of Donald Trump.
Yeah, this is where the book gets really interesting and also pretty controversial. Vance, as you know, is openly conservative. And he really tries to unpack why so many working-class white people like those he grew up with were drawn to Trump in 2016.
He uses that analogy of Trump's promises being like a pain reliever for a group of people feeling these deep economic and social anxieties.
Right, a way to numb the frustration and disillusionment, but not a cure for the underlying problems. And I think Vance's background allows him to present a perspective that a lot of people just weren't hearing at the time.
He's not just observing from afar. He's lived this experience. He's talking to his own family members, people who voted for Trump, trying to understand their motivations.
And those conversations are so revealing. They acknowledge that Trump might not have all the answers, but they appreciated that he was at least willing to challenge the elites, to address the issues they felt ignored by other politicians.
It speaks to that feeling of being unheard, of being looked down on by the coastal elites, the establishment.
Which Vance himself felt, even though he'd achieved that outsider success. Remember, he struggled with his own vote in 2016.
Yeah, he felt alienated from both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, ultimately choosing a third-party candidate. It really underscores the deep political divides in our country, and how sometimes it feels like none of the options represent your values or experiences.
It's that sense of disconnection, of not belonging. That, I think, really resonates with a lot of readers. And it's something that Vance explores on a personal level, too, especially when he talks about his experiences at Yale Law School.
Oh, yeah, he talks about feeling like an imposter, like he didn't really belong among all those privileged students. It's interesting. You'd think someone who'd achieved that level of success would feel confident.
You would think so, but I think it speaks to that hidden cost of upward mobility that Vance touches on. It's not just about getting the degree or the job. It's about navigating a whole new world with different social and cultural norms.
And you're doing it while carrying the baggage of your past. That sense of not quite fitting it. It can be isolating even when you've made it.
It can be. And Vance's story highlights something we often overlook. In these conversations about the American dream, success isn't just about money. It's about navigating these complex emotional and cultural transitions. It's about finding a way to honor your past while embracing new possibilities.
It's a lot more nuanced than we often give credit for. Now, one of the most common criticisms of Hillbilly Elegy is that it's too focused on individual responsibility. Critics argue that Vance doesn't sufficiently acknowledge those systemic factors, like racism, economic inequality, lack of access to healthcare.
It's a valid point, and it's a conversation worth having. Vance's perspective is, by his own admission, a conservative one. He emphasizes personal responsibility and self-reliance.
But is that emphasis on individual agency overshadow those structural barriers that so many people face, those systems that are often stacked against them?
That's where the real debate lies, I think. It's a delicate balance, and it's important to recognize that there are multiple perspectives on these complex issues. But remember, Hillbilly Elegy is a memoir. It's Vance's personal story.
It's not meant to be some sociological treatise offering solutions to all of America's problems.
Exactly. It's a starting point for a conversation, not the final word. And it's up to each of us to engage in those conversations thoughtfully and respectfully.
So we've covered Vance's journey, the challenges he faced, the complexities of life in Appalachia. But we haven't really delved into what Hillbilly Elegy reveals about the appeal of someone like Donald Trump, that connection between personal experience and the broader political landscape.
That's where the book really hit a nerve, and it's still relevant today. Vance describes Trump's promises as a pain reliever for communities feeling left behind.
Right, the alienation from the elites, the resentment towards immigrants, the anger at a system that seems rigged. Trump tapped into those raw emotions.
And offered simple solutions, even if those solutions were often divisive and harmful.
But Vance doesn't let Trump off the hook, does he? He compares him to a snake oil salesman offering false hope.
He does, but he also acknowledges the deep pain and frustration that fueled Trump's rise. It's a complicated and uncomfortable argument to make.
It is. Some praise Vance for offering a nuanced understanding of Trump voters, while others criticize him for normalizing racist or xenophobic views. But I think it's important to remember that he's trying to make sense of a phenomenon that confused a lot of people.
He's not condoning Trump. He's trying to understand why his message resonated with so many people who felt like they had nothing left to lose.
And that's a question that's still relevant today, as we see those same anxieties and resentments playing out in our politics.
Hillbilly Elegy doesn't give us easy answers, but it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our society, about the divides that separate us, and to ask ourselves, how do we heal those divides?
That's a question we'll continue to grapple with. And it's a question that leads us to the legacy of Hillbilly Elegy itself. How has this book shaped our understanding of social issues? And what impact has it had on the national conversation? We'll unpack that in just a moment. You know, it's interesting how Hillbilly Elegy, it's still sparking debate all these years later. It really seems to have touched a nerve, becoming a bestseller and even inspiring a film.
Yeah, it definitely captured people's attention. But alongside all the praise, there was a lot of criticism too, especially from those who felt like Vance was too harsh in his portrayal of Appalachia, or that he didn't fully grasp the complexities of poverty.
Some critics argued that focusing so much on personal responsibility and cultural factors kind of underplayed the systemic issues at play. Things like economic inequality, racism, lack of access to good education and healthcare. Those can trap people in a cycle of disadvantage no matter how hard they try.
Right. It's that idea that it's not just about bad choices or a culture of poverty. There are real barriers that prevent people from getting ahead, regardless of how hard they try. And I think that's a critique worth considering.
It's like saying individual choices matter. But let's not forget about those larger sources that shape those choices in the first place.
Exactly. Vance coming from a conservative viewpoint, leans towards emphasizing individual agency. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss the impact of systemic issues. I think both play a role in shaping people's lives and opportunities.
For sure. And I think it's important to consider Hillbilly Elegy's impact on the political landscape, too. It came out at such a pivotal time, just as Donald Trump was gaining momentum. Tapping into those same feelings of resentment and alienation that Vance describes.
Some argue that Hillbilly Elegy actually provided a framework for understanding the rise of Trumpism. Like it offered this glimpse into the hearts and minds of those white working-class voters who felt abandoned by the political establishment.
Almost like a cultural decoder ring, helping people outside those communities understand the anger and frustration that was driving that political shift.
But it's important to remember that Vance himself has criticized Trump, arguing that his solutions were ultimately empty, and his divisive rhetoric was damaging.
So the relationship between Hillbilly Elegy and the Trump phenomenon is complicated. It shed light on some of the factors that contributed to his rise, but it also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of that kind of populism.
Right, and that's what makes the book so enduring, I think. It's not just a snapshot of a particular moment in time. It speaks to these ongoing challenges. Poverty and inequality, the search for belonging in a rapidly changing world.
It forces us to examine our own values as a nation and ask some hard questions. How do we create a more just and equitable society where everyone has a chance to thrive, regardless of their background?
Yeah, and as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. Vance observes that many of those who found success from his background had married outsiders, people who brought different perspectives and a stabilizing influence.
It makes you think, what does that say about broadening our social circles, breaking down cultural barriers for upward mobility? Is success even possible without leaving your community behind?
Or is that just a form of survivor bias,
Right.
where only those with the skills and support to connect with outsiders were able to break free? Tough questions without easy answers, but they're worth pondering as we grapple with the challenges of social mobility and the longing for belonging in a world that's increasingly divided along lines of class, culture, and politics.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Hillbilly Elegy. It's a book that keeps us thinking, keeps the conversation going. It challenges our assumptions and prompts us to consider who we are and who we want to be as a nation.